Is the PowerPoint okay, Melissa?
Yep,
Correct.
you are all set. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're going to be discussing setting boundaries with adolescents in the age of social media. We are going to be talking not about any one specific app, but more generally how to support your adolescents as they're navigating increased access to technology and social media. We are pretty laid back, so please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat. We will answer those as we go. If you don't feel comfortable sending a question in the chat, you can also send a direct message to me. I will be monitoring those. Shelby, you can go to the next slide. Just a couple of quick housekeeping. Again, if you're just joining us, please type your school district into the chat or send that as a message to me. Our funders do require some general demographic information, so that helps us satisfy that requirement. If you would like a copy of today's slides, please send your email address via direct message to either Shelby or I. We'll make sure you get that. We are going to have participants muted, but if there's a question that you would like to ask, you are welcome to unmute yourself. And we will also be sending out an evaluation form after. We'll link that in the chat at the end. And that just helps us to be able to tailor our workshops to meet the needs of the communities that we serve. So we encourage and appreciate your support in completing that.
Oh man, I'm on the wrong thing. Okay.
So we always like to start with just a brief warning. Some of the topics that we discussed tonight may be sensitive and may cause an emotional response based on your own lived experience. If you find yourself needing a break for any reason, please take time away from your computer to take care of you. This presentation, again, is being recorded and can be viewed on Centero's YouTube channel at a later time. So a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight. We always like to start with just an overview of adolescence psychosocial development so that you can understand what's going on in the head of my teenager as we are diving into the world of social media and technology. We're going to hopefully increase awareness of the effects of social media, some lingo, some popular apps that we're seeing right now. Shelby and I both work with the adolescent and young adult population, so we can share a little bit about what we are seeing. We're also going to be talking about some strategies for teaching safety and healthy online boundaries, and more generally, how to set effective boundaries with adolescents. This can be a really challenging thing. We acknowledge that many of our adolescents are really striving for independence, and that's something that we may be able to give them in certain ways, but they aren't quite ready for the level of independence they think they're ready for. So we're going to talk about how to navigate that. So again, to start off, just understanding the adolescence and the adolescent brain. And I would imagine many of us who work with adolescents would say that is a really challenging thing to do. They've got a lot going on, and oftentimes they do not want to share that with adults. That is really normal. As we all know, adolescence is a time of really significant social and developmental change. They're really figuring out who they are and forming this self-identity. And with that, there can be some pretty significant fluctuations in self-esteem. There may be times where we're seeing adolescents who are really confident. Sometimes some might say even overconfident, and other times where, especially when they're comparing to peers, when they're feeling really low, when they're not feeling confident in the abilities that we know they have. So another characteristic of adolescence is risk taking. They are testing boundaries. They're trying to learn about what they're truly capable of. And there's a way to do this in a really safe way. However, what we often see is adolescents thinking they're invincible and engaging in some behaviors that may not be very safe. We also see that they're really shifting toward a focus on peer relationships, sometimes away from a focus on familial or relationships with trusted adults. And that can be really challenging to navigate, and we just want to assure you is a typical aspect of adolescents. So again, we mentioned their adolescence is characterized really by a lot of social and developmental change. Some of the things that I want to highlight is, again, they're spending less time with caregivers and more time with peers. They really value their independence. And they're also doing a lot of rule and boundary testing, which can lead to conflict. This rule and boundary testing is normal and can be really frustrating. As they're seeking that independence, their autonomy, they may push for compromise and they really want their opinions about the rules to be heard. They may, at the end of the day, say, you know what, I understand that this rule exists, but I want to make sure that you know that I don't agree with it. They want to feel heard. And that comes with, in part, this exploration of self-identity. They are figuring out who they are, what values are important to them, and they're learning how to advocate and how to navigate and how to challenge and not necessarily accept things as they are. They're learning to think independently, which is a really great thing. With that exploration of self-identity, they're also seeing themselves as individuals rather than just a part of the family unit. Again, this is really important for them to reach identity achievement, which is something that happens in their typically early to mid 20s, but can be navigating as we're addressing changing relationships. Again, those fluctuations in self-esteem and healthy risk taking. It's really important for them to take healthy risks, such as joining a new sport, trying a challenging class. That is how they learn, and that in and of itself is not a bad thing. Where we start to become concerned is where they're engaging in unhealthy or unsafe risk-taking behaviors, which we are going to talk about in just a little while. Social media, as we all know, creates a new layer and a new challenges for adolescents and parents. And so often we get the question, and is it bad? Or we hear parents or caregivers say, my child is never going to be on social media. And I absolutely understand the sentiment behind that. And the reality is that it may not be realistic with the access that adolescents have, but also how social media and technology is now being used, especially as we're entering this new stage of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that connection is really important. So some of the pros are, again, building that community, those connections. It can be a source of entertainment. It can also be a really great avenue for self-expression. We see teenagers creating on TikTok, on Instagram. You may have accounts that are focused on promoting art or promoting music. It's a really great chance for them to share their creative endeavors in ways that may not be as readily available in a structured academic environment. It also gives them exposure to current events. And I think Shelby may talk about later, what we're now seeing is that adolescents and people overall are starting to actually seek information about current events more from TikTok than from Google. So it's a really interesting shift. So again, there are pros. A couple of cons that we like to acknowledge as well. High social media use can lead to increased risk for anxiety or depression. It's not a direct correlation, one causes the other, but it can be a factor for individuals who have other risk factors for anxiety, depression, in part because there are a lot of opportunities for comparison, but comparison of potentially not the full reality. Social media gives us an opportunity to really curate a persona or an experience. And so what we often are navigating with our teenagers is they're saying, okay, everyone has X or everyone is doing Y, but they're only basing that based off what they see on social media. And we know that that's only a brief snapshot. It's not the full picture. We also know on social media, opportunities for cyberbullying and unsafe use exist. And we're going to talk a little bit more about both of those and how to address those.
Okay. So if you guys want to just kind of type in the chat, what are some of the things as you, are thinking about your children, whether where they are at right now or as they're getting older? What are some of the things that you notice as your biggest concern with their social media use? I'll give everyone just a little bit longer if you want to just type something really quickly in the chat. Okay, overuse of social media, parental controls, both very, very common and completely understandable. Not allowing it at the moment, but connection to strangers and negative influences. Unhealthy communication with peers or oversharing. Okay, great answers. Distracted from their studies. Yep, understandable. Yeah, and so all of those are very understandable, very common, and we'll talk a little bit about how to hopefully help you feel a little bit more comfortable with social media, because as Melissa had mentioned, and as we will talk about, it is not going away, right? And as much as we would love for it to in some aspects, there are just a lot of the parts of it are here to stay. And now that we have this generation of young people that are growing up with technology, when we think about ourselves, and I'm not terribly old, but I know that technology really didn't start coming into my life until I was in late elementary school, really middle school and high school. And we are having kids a part of a generation where everybody has access to technology from the moment that they are like toddlers. And so it's not going away. We have a generation that is growing up with it and is used to it and probably knows how to use it better than we will. And so social media, while we know that we can't necessarily prevent it altogether as much as we would like to, the question then becomes, how are we going to prepare our children for navigating the social media and technology in a safe way? If it's not going to go away, we want our kids to be able to use it safely. And part of that is teaching them basically what we want from them, right? Similarly to how it mentions here, like we don't just hand our kids the key to the car when they turn 16 and say, all right, go forth. They have to take classes, they have to practice, they then have to take a test and show that they are capable of using this machine. And similarly, we want to be able to teach our kids how to use social media and their phone and technology in general in a safe way. And so allowing them to similarly, we're not necessarily going to have them full on take classes, but teaching them what we want them to know about safe technology use. And I want to acknowledge that might look different for every family, right? So, every family has a different standard and a different idea of what they feel comfortable with when it comes to social media, when it comes to technology in general. So there's no hard and fast line of everybody has to follow the exact same rules or guidelines. And you as a family will decide what feels best for your family, and that's totally understandable. But we know that kids will start to ask questions, and there does come a point when maybe we have a middle schooler who says, well, all my friends have a phone, why don't I have a phone? And being prepared for how we're going to navigate those conversations is really important. And when you do decide to eventually give your child access to that technology, when you feel that they're at the appropriate age, we ask ourselves, are they mature enough to be able to navigate the internet in a way that is safe and healthy? And are they responsible enough to know what to do in certain situations? And so we have those conversations. We go with them and practice, show that they know what they are doing and how to handle certain situations. And so similarly to, like this example says, driving a car, we want to make sure that they have the tools necessary. So how can we teach our kids how to use the technology and social media safely? And so this is a little bit of the language that we'll often use when it comes to social media safety. So we have cyberbullying, identity theft, sexting, and online grooming. And we want to be really intentional that having these conversations with your children about what these are can be really important and very empowering. We need children to understand, what does cyberbullying look like? At this point, I would say that's probably a conversation they're already having in school, but we don't want to assume. But cyberbullying is something that schools tend to be very aware of because they get a lot of reports of it. And so a lot of times those conversations are happening, but if we cannot assume that that's already, happened in school. So we want to make sure to have a conversation with our children. Cyberbullying, is basically what happens when somebody bullies you from behind a keyboard or from behind their phone, but using some sort of electronic technology. Then we have identity theft. And again, a really important conversation, which I think that we see with both young people and maybe sometimes older people, of recognizing what are the signs that somebody is, maybe running a scam, and we don't want to give our identity or personal information or private information to somebody that we don't know. So talking about that very openly and knowing what to look out for. And then sexting is another conversation absolutely to have. We, especially working with teenagers, see this more often than I think we would like to. But having that conversation of what you put out there, no matter who you send it to, it is out there forever. And that is a really sobering conversation to have with our teenagers. We know, as Melissa had mentioned, like their brain is not fully developed yet. And so they might not have the full understanding of like, this thing that I'm about to do is going to follow me for a very long time. And so it is really important to have those conversations, sometimes from, a younger age, maybe in middle school, right when they have the responsibility of having a phone. This is something that we have to be very aware of. If you put it on the internet, if you send it to somebody else, it can't come back. We always use the analogy of like when you squirt out a whole tube of toothpaste, you cannot put the toothpaste back in the tube. And so it's out there. And so we have to be really careful what we are putting out there because we can't always get it back. And then online grooming. This is another really important conversation to have with a young person of what do we need to be aware of. This is basically when an adult will have some sort of inappropriate behavior towards a young person, no matter what age it is, putting them at risk for sexual offense. And so an example of this would be like, I think probably we can think about, what was that old show, To Catch a Predator? That was absolutely an example that we would see of grooming, where an adult could be acting like a younger person, or they don't necessarily have to be, but they are talking to a young person in a way that is trying to lead them into sexually promiscuous behavior, or just grooming them into what they want them to be. It doesn't necessarily have to even be sexual in nature, but just being really intentional about who are we talking to, how are we recognizing when what they're doing could potentially be grooming. I love that it has LinkedIn on here as a as a little icon, like we're using LinkedIn for this. But when we are talking about social media, we want to be really aware, what are the social media platforms that our children are using? It's super important that we know what platforms they are getting on. And so you can see over here on the right side, just kind of how social media has changed over, since 2014, 2015, it is drastically changing. We know that, back in 2014, 15, Facebook used to be huge. It used to be one of those things that everybody was using. Not anymore. Nowadays, we are really seeing TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. YouTube is definitely up there. It's being used in, I think, a different way than some of the other ones are. The other social media platforms are more so being used now for like interaction amongst friends. YouTube is more used towards, influencers are using it. And I know kids are really into like unboxing videos. So things like that, but it is absolutely a social media platform that we would consider, something that we want to monitor. But really TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat, those are the ones that we are noticing that adolescents are using heavily when it comes to different apps. Facebook, not so much of a concern with younger people anymore. Twitter is also one that has been declining. Twitch, if you don't know what Twitch is, if you have a child that is really into like video games, for instance, Twitch is like a gaming streaming service. So they'll watch other people play games or stream their own games. And I know that sounds harmless, but again, we want to be very careful of like some people will go on there and stream games and maybe use language that's inappropriate that we're not, comfortable with, or they'll talk about things and, we can't always monitor what the other people are saying. WhatsApp is just an app that messages people that uses the internet instead of like SMS texting that we would use. Reddit is, like people sharing opinions and threads about different topics. And Tumblr is sort of similar to Reddit, but those are obviously used much less frequently than the big ones of TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. So
do you want to jump in really quick? Another one that we're seeing a lot, and this isn't necessarily a social media platform, but on video games where there's any kind of chat function, we're seeing a lot of conversation that kids are having in those, sometimes with known peers, but oftentimes they are able to communicate with anyone, depending on the game and depending on the settings that are available and the settings that you have put in place. But we're seeing quite a lot of that kids talking to other people and not necessarily being able to confirm the identity of those individuals. So just something to keep in mind. Even things like Minecraft and I believe Roblox do have that functionality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So with that, we know that all of these apps have very different ways of sharing information and they have different privacy settings. That is something that we want to be really intentional about looking into beforehand of how can I, as a parent, monitor, what my child is doing on these different apps. One thing to be very aware of, like on Instagram, for instance, is teenagers will have what they call finstas. And so they are not their typical content. So they'll do it where like they'll have one Instagram account and it's open for kind of anybody to see, or they'll only allow like they'll allow you as a parent to see the information on their Instagram, but then they'll have a finsta, which is short for fake Insta. And so it is where they share things that they just have between them and their friends. And so we want to be really careful of, does my child have something like that? And how can I monitor that? So helping you as the parent feel empowered to know what might we be seeing from our children. And really doing your own research of, how all of these different apps, like what you need to be aware of for the different apps. What should you be aware of for TikTok, for Instagram, and for Snapchat? And how knowledgeable are you on all of those apps? So just kind of keeping that in mind. So I know Melissa had already mentioned a couple apps. Are there any that aren't on this list that your kids have talked about, or that you have heard of, that might be kind of popping up? I know a new one actually, now that I just thought about this, is the app BeReal. That is taken off within kind of the last month or two here. And so if you don't know what that is, it's an app where very similar to like Instagram or Snapchat, where they're taking pictures like in real time. But yeah, BeReal is like they're taking a picture of whatever, they have like a certain amount of time, like 30 seconds to take a picture of like what they are doing in that moment. And so again, that can be really a good conversation to have of like, if you're in that situation, if you are on that app, what are we and what are we not taking pictures of? We're not going to take pictures of our personal information and put it out there, even if you think that your friends are the only ones that are seeing it. Any other apps that you guys have heard of or that you know that your kids are using? Okay. So it is really important that as we are looking at social media use and just technology use in general, that we are having boundaries with our social media use. So boundaries, regardless of what context we're talking about, boundaries are important for everybody, whether we're talking about it with social media or we're talking about it with just family members and conversations. It is really important for children to learn the importance of boundaries and talking about that as a way of this is for their safety, it's for their mental health. And so it's a good conversation to have as a whole. Now for social media specifically, we know, and maybe in general too, adolescents are going to push back on boundaries. They are uncomfortable. They don't always like being told what to do. They want to have that freedom and that privacy, and they want to be able to kind of, run their own world. And that's what happens when we get adolescents, because they want that independence, right? That is, as Melissa had mentioned, a time of a push for some really big independence, and they want to be with their friends. And so we're going to see a pushback of boundaries, and that's totally normal. It's really important as a parent that you're managing your own frustration. You're maintaining that open communication. You're modeling a good example of, frustration tolerance and also healthy communication when things maybe don't go our way. And we always say in our conversations with parents and teachers, the best thing for a dysregulated and distressed child is a regulated and calm adult. And so if you've ever had a conversation with any child and you recognize that you're really upset and they're really upset, it's probably not going anywhere positive. And so it's really important that as an adult, you stay calm and regulated yourself, which can be really hard. I want to acknowledge, especially when we know that what we are saying and the boundary we're putting in place is for their own safety. And it's for, the good of them as they get older. But, it's okay and it's understandable and normal. They're going to get frustrated. We just want to make sure that we're staying calm for ourselves. So boundaries, there are 4 general types of boundaries. So we have rigid, those are the hard and fast rules where there's like non-negotiables. That's where we would maybe be saying like, this is what you are allowed to do. There's absolutely no room for negotiation. And this is what we've set forth. Then we have the flexible boundaries, which require, some compromise where, we're saying this is what we need. What do you want out of this? And how can we come to a compromise? Then we have the soft boundaries, where boundaries basically aren't followed and they're easily changed, where we might say like, this is what I need you to do, but then not follow through with something. And then we have the spongy boundaries, which are a combination of rigid and soft. They can be confusing and difficult to follow. And I want to acknowledge that there are going to be some times where we weave in and out of different boundaries. There is no one specific boundary that most families stay within forever, all the time. And so we might sometimes weave in and out, which again can be a little confusing. But we might have different boundaries for different situations, right? We might have different boundaries for social media than we do when our children go and they hang out with their friends. And so again, that can be confusing, especially for children. So the important piece here is just having that open communication, being honest about why these boundaries are in place, and why we're having these conversations, why we are having these expectations of our children. So why are these boundaries so important? So again, as I had mentioned, we our children are going to go through this period of independence. It's super important for them. We also really need for them to be able to follow the rules. And so when we're drawing a boundary with somebody, again, regardless of what it's related to, we want those to be clear, like very, very clear with our expectations of what we are asking from the other person. And they need to be routine. So essentially they need to be very consistent. It is not helpful when we're drawing boundaries with adolescents to say, I'm going to, you cross this boundary, I'm going to ground you for 2 weeks. And then it never happens and we never follow through with it. Or after a couple of days, we just let them go back to normal life. It's really important, especially for adolescents, that if we're drawing a boundary and boundaries have to have some sort of consequence that go with them. I will be very clear in saying that a boundary without a consequence is just a suggestion. So if we are not having a consequence that goes along with our boundary, then we're basically just saying like, I hope you do this. And that's not helpful. So we have to have some sort of consequence that goes along with the boundary. So they have to be consistent. It's really, really important. So this helps them to learn not only the expectations at home, but at school. And eventually, I mean, when we're really thinking about it long term, our goal as parents is to make sure that kids are able to grow up and be healthy and happy and productive members of society, right? And we have to make sure that they understand how to navigate boundaries and expectations so that as they get older, it's something that's not new or foreign to them. So it helps them also improve their self-advocacy and their reasoning skills. And so when we're thinking about boundaries, especially the boundaries that maybe are, I'll go back real quick, that are flexible, that is an opportunity for an adolescent to learn, like, we are able to advocate for ourselves, that we're able to say, this is why I feel really passionate about this. This is why, I feel that this is what I deserve. And again, especially for social media, it might be for our adolescents that we have more flexible boundaries around social media and technology. Maybe for like elementary school kids, those are rigid, right? They're hard and fast. We say, nope, you're too young. This is non-negotiable. As they get into adolescence and high school, we might not be able to have those same rigid boundaries. We might have to weave into the flexible boundaries where we're able to say, tell me what you want and how can we come to a compromise that feels okay for both of us. If we are not asking them what they want, it's not going to be a flexible boundary. It just doesn't get into that area. So again, boundaries are really important for our kids to learn how they can advocate for themselves, as well as rational thought and reasoning skills. So drawing boundaries around technology is really important. Again, it helps us maintain safe use of technology and social media, helps them prepare for adulthood where they have to manage that and, manage the technology and have responsibilities. And I think we're seeing it so often nowadays, and having these conversations with our kids is really important. Of, again, what you put on the internet stays there forever, but more specifically, with most things being video nowadays, we have no idea who might be videotaping us. I know that's kind of a scary thing to think about, but just in the sense of there are videos of children being, adolescents being in stores and maybe doing something really silly or stupid. And then it's out there on the internet and kids are losing scholarships and, are having their workplace or their school being told what they're doing. And so it's really important that it's a conversation to have of being aware of your surroundings, understanding that just because your friend put this thing on social media and you thought it was funny, it's out there forever still. And what are we doing with our friends? Is somebody recording this thing? So being that a lot of the social media use nowadays is very video based, we want to be really careful about our actions, and it has to come with some sort of responsibility.
Perfect. Before I jump into this, there was a question in the chat about the GAS app and if kids use this. This is not one that I'm hearing a lot in the communities that I work with. I'm seeing Shelby shake her head. No, that's not to say that it's not being used, but it's just not one that I think either of us, at least in our direct service, are hearing about. So Shelby did a really great job. Oh, did you have something?
I think it said you wanted to unmute me.
Oh, nope, I hit the wrong button. So Shelby did a great job of talking about different types of boundaries, and absolutely different circumstances may necessitate different types of boundaries. But then the big question is, okay, how do we set them? And this on paper seems much more straightforward than it actually is when you have that smaller human in front of you and you're trying to be rational with someone whose brain is not fully developed and they may not fully understand. So one of the most important components of an effective boundary is effective communication. We don't want to assume that kids know what we're thinking or what we expect if we have not explicitly stated it. And oftentimes kids need to hear boundaries not just once, but multiple times. It's just how they learn. They need that repetition. So we can't say, oh, you should have known if we haven't had that conversation. So being really upfront and clear about what we expect. Consistency is also a really important one. If we're setting a boundary, we want to make sure that we are enforcing that boundary. And we want to make sure that the other adults who may be involved in that child's life are supporting that. What we often see, again, with that boundary testing is kids may have a really clear and effective boundary set, and then they're going to go to another adult in their life and see if there's any flexibility. And so if there's a boundary that you've set that is important for other people in your child's life to know, if that's other family members, or if that's a coach or an adult within a faith community, making sure that you're communicating that with them so that they can support you with that consistency. And that also means that if there is testing of that boundary, that we're enforcing it every time. Now, one of the challenges with social media is because it's happening on a phone or on a Chromebook or on a tablet, we may not always be able to catch kids when they're doing that boundary testing. And that's where parental controls can really come in handy. And so familiarizing yourself on a specific device and setting those in advance, but as much as we're able to, being consistent and also following through. If we're following through with, if we're saying that we're going to enforce a consequence, we need to follow through on that, because when we don't, what kids learn is they aren't serious, or that's not important. And that's when they're going to put less weight or less value on that boundary you've set, and they're going to test it more. We as adults also have a really fantastic opportunity to model for our kids how to respect boundaries. Now, the boundaries that we set for ourselves as adults are probably going to look different than those we're setting for our young people. And so it may be talking through, hey, I'm setting this screen time limit for myself, and here's what that looks like. And then talking through that. Or, you know what, I started to go to this site, but then realized this isn't something that aligns with our family's values and beliefs. And so I navigated away. And having those conversations for them, it also allows them to see that you're human, that we might make mistakes, but also the importance and how boundaries can be beneficial at any age. Then they're less likely to see it as something you're doing just because you want to take away all of their fun, and more because you want to be a healthy and productive and safe adult. And again, reinforcing positive behavior. There are so many times when our kids are using technology and social media in a really appropriate, healthy way. And we want to acknowledge that. That way they are less likely to feel like, oh, they're only getting on my case when I'm doing something wrong. It's important to them that we're seeing the things they're doing well. So again, with effective communication, having a discussion about the rules and boundaries you're putting in place, and when at all possible, having those rules and boundaries right at the beginning. we are seeing now kids are getting devices at a much younger age, and that's just because of how they're using technology with their peers. That's because of their involvement in extracurriculars and how they're using it at school. And so I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, my child's had a phone for a couple of years, we can't have this discussion. You absolutely can, if you have the opportunity to have it at the beginning, when there's a new app that they're looking to get on, or when they get a new device. Even better, it's just setting the expectations from the start. You can also collaborate with your child for greater buy-in. Like Shelby mentioned, they are having conversations about digital literacy and citizenship starting in elementary school. They're having conversations about healthy social media use as young as elementary school. It's built into the health curricula in many school districts. And so these conversations may not be brand new to them. So you can even ask them, hey, what have you talked about in school? What are the rules at school around technology use? Are there any of those that you think make sense, that are reasonable? Are there any that you think, hey, that I don't agree with that? And have a conversation. At the end of the day, you as the adult still get to set the boundary, but at least they feel like they're being heard. Again, making sure rules and consequences are clearly communicated. So for example, saying something like, getting in trouble at school will result in having your phone taken away for X number of days is much more clear and specific than don't get in trouble at school. You're connecting a very specific consequence to that action instead of leaving something pretty vague. If your child is earning, quote unquote, more tech time, make sure that the expectations for either earning or having time taken away are clear. I really encourage families, type it out, have it somewhere, have it posted somewhere in your house, because so many kids are really visual learners. And that's a great thing for you to go back to say, you know what, it's there, it's in writing. We all see that, we all know, here's what the expectation is. With technology, with social media, like Shelby was talking about all of the different apps, there are a lot of different avenues that we could go down. And there's the potential to develop a really long list of rules really quickly to address all of the different ways that kids may be using technology and social media. However, less is more. Having a few rules that are clear and can be easier to follow, can be much easier to follow and to enforce than a longer list of unclear rules. With many of these apps, there are enough similarities that you can set some clear overarching guidelines. And then if you feel like we need to have any specific rules for specific apps or devices, that's totally fine. If you are using a phone monitoring app, or for a tablet or whatever else, we really encourage parents to talk about that with their child from the start. It really increases transparency and trust, and it avoids future conflict. They're going to understand that this is just an expectation, and they're less likely to feel like, oh, my adult is sneaking around and trying to spy on me. I think most of the school districts in the Central Ohio area do have a monitoring platform that they are using at school. I've heard of GoGuardian, I've heard of Bloxy, there are many of those. So again, these are things that your children are familiar with, and those are communicated to them. They understand, or at least have been told at school, that every movement they make on a school device can be tracked. So this concept is not new to them. However, school and home are a little bit different. So again, talking about that beforehand, saying, hey, we're going to put this on your phone. Here's how it's going to be used. Here's why, and allowing time for conversation and questions. Consistency and follow through, and this can be really challenging, especially if you have a young person who's doing a lot of boundary testing. But if the rules or boundaries that you've set for your child are broken, it is important to follow through on the consequences. Again, it it reinforces expectations, and it creates a more firm boundary. When at all possible, we also really want the consequence to be connected to the action. So an example might be if you don't finish your homework because you are on your phone, you're distracted, then that might mean that you're losing your phone time for the next day. That's directly connected to the action. But the example that Shelby used earlier of, oh, if you, do this thing, if you get in trouble at school, you're, grounded for 2 weeks, that may or may not be connected. Again, is going to be specific to each family, but we want it to be related. We don't want to say that they're losing a completely unrelated thing. I also want to put a quick plug just in general is pro-social activities, sports, after school clubs. There are so many benefits that kids gain from being a part of those. And while they may look like a reward or a privilege, I strongly encourage families to explore other alternative consequences than taking away a sport or an extracurricular club, because the benefits that they're gaining from being involved with that is just too great. Again, consistency with rules and consequences maintains those firm boundaries. So kids should know what to expect if the rules are broken, and there may be less pushback on consequences if they're applied consistently. Now, what we know is that humans in general don't like change, and setting a new rule or boundary, while kids may ultimately enjoy that because they know what's expected of them, at the onset, there may be pushback, and you may see a spike in behaviors as they're adjusting to that rule. Hold fast, don't panic. That's a really normal progression. And it may take a couple of weeks of them getting used to that boundary. And then what we often see is then there's less pushback or there's less conflict. Now, if you are, saying, hey, we're enforcing this boundary really consistently, and 3 months in and we're still getting really significant pushback, talk to someone, if that's at the school or another trusted person in your community. But if it's just been a few days or even a few weeks, that's okay. We also talked earlier about modeling. Set an example by following rules yourself. If you're creating rules for your child around technology use, follow those. A really great example, if your child is not allowed to use their phone at the dinner table, make sure you're doing the same. If we are setting expectations around any kind of designated family time or device-free time, make sure you're enforcing that. And that even goes down to things like a smartwatch. Kids are really perceptive, and they notice when we are following the same rules that they are, and they notice when we're not. If you follow your child on social media, make sure that you're following the same rules you give them as far as online communication, as far as what is okay and not okay to post. Because you'd better believe that if you're following them and they're following you, they are going to notice the first time that you post something in your feed that you told them that they weren't allowed to post. Now, again, every family is different. And so if there is going to be any variation in those boundaries based on age or developmental stage, having that clear conversation from the beginning. The boundaries we set for an elementary age student who's just getting a phone for the first time may look really different than the boundaries you set for your 17-year-old. They are going to notice that. They're going to ask, why does my sibling get to do X when I'm not allowed to? Having that conversation and talking about what behaviors you would need to see from them to be able to consider changing that boundary. Reinforcing positive behavior. Again, it's really important to recognize the things that your child is doing well. So if you notice, for example, that they've been doing really well with not using their phone at dinner, or hey, they shared something really positive on social media, you appreciated the quote that they posted that really resonated with you, or you were really excited to see the picture from their soccer game that they won. Let them know that. This reinforces that positive behavior and therefore makes it more likely that they're going to continue to engage. It also, again, highlights that effective communication and shows them your support. And then when you have to have those potentially difficult or challenging conversations, you're more likely to have that buy-in because they know, even though we have to address this thing, that my parent or my adult still sees the positive things that I'm doing, and they're less likely to feel like they're just noticing the things that aren't going well. A couple of examples of, go ahead, Shelby. Of some digital boundaries. And again, these may be different depending on your family, depending on your child, depending on the device. One that I always like to really emphasize is setting the precedent that you are the parent and you are in control. I think what we hear so much, especially our middle school and our high school kids, is they took my phone. And I always ask my students, do you pay for that phone? And 99% of the time, the answer is no. And I say, okay, whose name is on the bill? And they'll say, my parent or my grandparent or whoever their adult is. If they are not paying for that device, it does not belong to them. It belongs to you. And so setting that precedent from the beginning. Encouraging unplugging, especially as we're seeing more research about blue light and how that impacts REM sleep, helping your child to have designated time away from their device. And maybe that's, hey, an hour before bed, everyone's just going to turn off devices. We're going to charge them outside of the room, outside of the bedroom, just to decrease that temptation. What I hear a lot from kids is, but that's my alarm clock. If it is possible to get a digital clock or an alarm that is not on their phone, that's really beneficial, because if they wake up in the middle of the night and they go to check their phone, it's going to impact their ability to get back into REM sleep, and it's potentially going to suck them in. They're going to see notifications and they're going to be up until 3, 4, 5 in the morning on their phone, not sleeping.
I was going to say, kind of on top of that, I work primarily now with college students, but majority of my career has been with adolescents. And the reason they are going to bed at 2 a.m. is not because they are doing their homework, that it is because they are on technology. It's because they're on their phone and they cannot get themselves off. And so having those very, very clear boundaries of at night, at this time, this is when the phone goes away, because it's very easy to get them sucked in. I will also say too, TikTok specifically, and I believe that the other apps do as well, have like a time app. Have a time like where you can set it so they're only on it for a certain amount of time. And then after that, it pops up with a notification of you've been on it, for your allotted time. You have to put in the code to continue. And if the kids don't know the code, then, great. So, making sure that we are having something like that too. You can also do it where it's like at a certain time of night, it's no longer to be able to be in use. There are some really cool things out there. Just if you Google them, finding something that will give you some ideas of how you can set those limits.
Yeah. A couple of others, I really encourage families, keep, if you've got, computer, tablets, keep those in high traffic areas of the home. Maybe the computer, the laptop lives in the family room, because that's a place where people congregate, because that makes it less likely that kids are going to try to sneak things, because they know, hey, there's just too many people around. And it also gives you an opportunity to just have conversations. If that laptop is there, if they're on it, it's something that you can work more naturally into conversation and keep that at the forefront. Establishing limits for which sites, apps kids can visit and for how long. Like Shelby mentioned, there are some really, really fantastic tools that apps are building in. A lot of phones have some kind of screen time, but they don't have kind of that level of you have to plug in a code. The apps and sites kids can be on and how long they can be on those will likely vary based on their age, and that is okay. It may be, hey, we're comfortable with having you on these apps when you're in 6th grade, but these apps or this site, we're going to wait. This also, there is so much change so quickly with so many of these apps, which is why we don't spend too much time on any one app, because like Shelby said, Be Real became popular in the last month. It changes so quickly. And so your boundaries and your expectations may evolve as the technology does. It can also be really helpful to surf the internet with your child. Let them show you what they like to do online. That gives you a chance to get to see in real time what they're on. And it'll also allows them to be able to connect with you in a way that we might not have thought of, especially since the start of the pandemic. We all have become so reliant on social media and technology to stay connected. And so the ways that we've used it have really evolved, even just in the past 2.5 years. Give them a chance to show you what that looks like. A really important one, know who's connecting with your child online and setting rules for any social networking, messaging, gaming, using webcams. Have really clear conversations with your kids about how do we know that someone is who they say they are? How can we confirm that? Can we confirm that? What do you do if you receive a request from someone and you're not able to verify their identity? Because this is happening all the time. And it's really easy to inadvertently connect with someone and not know who they are. So setting those expectations, and maybe occasionally going through a friend list with your child and having them say, who is this? Tell me about your connection with this person, and how do we know that they are who they say they are? Again, just keeping that open and ongoing conversation about online safety. This is not a one and done, because the technology is changing so rapidly and will continue to. So we want to make sure that we're constantly having those conversations. And again, modeling, limit your own use. It normalizes it for kids.
I will say too, in the very beginning, we had mentioned something about how social media kind of opens the door for kids to do a lot of comparing. And so they will often compare themselves to other people, what they see on, influencers, or even people that they go to school with. And it is really, really important. Yes, modeling that too, of not comparing yourself to other people, but having a conversation with them about what we see online is not always going to be what happens in real life. Like it is, I've had to dispel that constantly, because it is something that I hear so frequently of that person, they have filters on, they have touched it, retouched it, that they are not, that picture is not what is real life. I had a lot of conversations about like using critical thinking skills of this thing that this person said. Just because they put it out there does not mean it's true, right? Just because they made a video on TikTok about all of these things does not mean that this is exactly how this is. And one person's experience, like an example, I have a student who really wants to go into like the beauty industry, cosmetology specifically, but she saw a TikTok about how somebody had a terrible experience in that field. So now she thinks it's going to be really toxic. So we had to have a conversation about that person's experience is not everybody's experience. So making sure that we are having those conversations of critical thinking and, not comparing ourselves to other people. So to kind of wrap it up, I know we are out of time. Here are a few resources, books that you can read for improving your ability to work with your children on smart screen time and, becoming cyber savvy, as we like to say. So here's a few books, and then a few apps for social media and technology monitoring. So taking a look at those, and we, Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but we'll send this out as a PDF. Is that something? Or do we
Yeah,
not?
if you would like a copy of the slides, please send me a direct message with a good email address to reach you out, and we'd be more than happy to send you the slides. Again, this will also be posted on Centero's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. So if you miss something, if you want to go back and check these resources, they'll be linked there as well. I'm going to stop recording in a minute so that folks feel comfortable asking questions. But thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you are able to fill out the evaluation form, that is really helpful for us. And then our next parent workshop will be, I believe, beginning of February. So keep an eye on our social media and on communication from your school districts about that.
And we